What does it mean to be a disciple, a follower of Jesus? Look with me at the screen and let's read these last few verses together. Start with me at the top. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Next slide. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell, and great was the fall of it. So tell me, what's a disciple? What's a learner? Okay. I think Clyde said a child of God. A follower. A student. Okay, very good. Jesus, when he called the disciples to him, he called them and he began to teach them his way, didn't he? Okay, take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. Anyone else? A teacher of what? An apprentice. Ooh, that's a great word. That's a great word. One writer has put it this way: a disciple or apprentice is simply someone who has decided to be with another person under appropriate conditions in order to become capable of doing what that person does or to become what that person is. To do what that person does or to become what that person is. Jesus said this, those who hear, we just read it, those who hear and do my words. He's describing disciples in those last few verses that we've read, that we all read together. He's describing what disciples are, people who hear and who do his words. The subject of what constitutes a Christian has surfaced in the content of recent political discussion. Suffice it today to say that Jesus describes being a Christian or being a disciple as being one who hears and does what my words are. Hears and does what my words are. Those are the folks who become his disciple. Another writer says, anyone who is not a continual student of Jesus, who nevertheless reads the great promises of the Bible as if they were for him or her, is like someone trying to cash a check on someone else's bank account. And at best, it succeeds only sporadically. If we are going to be a follower of Jesus, it's not just enough to hear. It's not even enough for you to believe it. It's only as we do. Because Jerry gave us a great word, an apprentice. What's the end game for an apprentice? Yeah, you become able to do what your boss, what your trainer is showing you how to do. And so it wouldn't be enough, if you're apprenticing as a plumber, it wouldn't be enough for you to know what kind of pipes you use, to understand how plumbing systems fit together and how they function. It wouldn't even be enough for you to be able to take somebody to a place to buy all the right equipment. You've got to know how to put it together. And that's what Jesus is talking to us about. Not just knowing about, but doing from the heart. The practice of routine obedience from the heart is what Jesus is leading us to in the Sermon on the Mount. Because when we talk about doing what Jesus has said, it's very easy for us to become legalistic, isn't it? It's very easy for us to be just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees of Jesus' day, who are so meticulously concerned about the thing that you do, that any way to get the doing done works for them. And that's not what Jesus is talking about either. Because if our obedience to Him is simply a legalistic obedience to some words on a page, then we have missed the point. Because what Jesus is calling us to do, the first thing that a disciple following a teacher learns to do is to love the teacher. To learn to love the teacher. Now, some teachers can be harsh. Some teachers can be very to the point, especially when we miss the point a lot. And they can get frustrated with us, okay? Because do you remember how many times Jesus became frustrated with His disciples? How long have I been with you and you haven't learned this yet? But the obedience that we do, the doing of what Jesus has told us to do, isn't about just every legalistic step, but it's about doing what we do because we love Him the most. And so we allow Him to shape and form our lives to be like Him because we love Him and because we want to be like Him. And that's what discipleship is about. A lot of times our thoughts about discipleship have ideas of rigidity to them. When somebody talks about discipling, what comes to your mind? Discipline. Yeah. And anything else? I think of being in a study group, reading things and answering questions and putting stuff down in a notebook and things that are... Okay, yeah, there's an increase in knowledge. And that is a part of it. But it isn't about a rigid knowledge acquisition matter alone. It's about learning to love the one who is teaching us. Routine obedience from the heart. Routine obedience from the heart. That is a way for us to think about discipleship. It's routine, it is obedience, but it's from the heart. I don't do it because I have to, I do it because I want to please Jesus. I want to love Him. No doubt Jesus understood very well ahead of time that every imaginable way would be tried to avoid doing things the way he was teaching his disciples to do them. And that we do the same thing. Of course, I forgot who I was talking to. None of you here this morning have ever done anything other than what Jesus would want you to do, right? Okay. And yet we all come to a place in our lives where we realize, probably I should have paid attention to Jesus first. The disciples' lives, or a disciple's life, for any discipling relationship, have this unique component. We do what the teacher does. And you know why we do it that way? Because Jesus tells us, this is how my kingdom works. This is how my kingdom works. If you want to do it another way, that's your business. But this is how my kingdom works. And it's true across the board. I was thinking about this in terms of other places where there are different schools of thought. In one of the things that I've talked with Chad a lot about are the different schools of philosophy that exist in the world. And there are certain philosophers who have addressed a whole range of thought here. And then there's another philosopher. There's continental philosophy that isn't quite as popular as it used to be. And then Chad's always talking to me about new philosophers that seem to be cropping up who have different ideas about how life ought to be lived. And people adopt their philosophical viewpoint and begin living their lives that way. And they allow these teachers to mold them. Artists and musicians do the same thing. Back around the turn of the 1900s, there was a school of Impressionism in art. And there were painters who, it wasn't so much a stark figure in reality, it was the hint of the figure. And so there were artists who followed after that school of painting. You have jazz musicians who are, they're fusion jazz musicians, or you have other instrumentalists that are into rock music or hip hop or classical music. All of these are people who allow their lives and their music, in this particular case, to be shaped by a particular school of thought. That's exactly the way things work. Same thing is true as we come into our relationship with Jesus. Jesus made a strong statement to our followers. Luke 14:33. So likewise, whoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. Listen to that. He who does not forsake all that he hath, or she, cannot be my disciple. So Jesus is not saying that we're excluded. He's not saying I'm shutting some of you out, but simply that there are things that in our lives, if we are not devoted to those things, we can't be his disciple. It just won't work. It just will not work. And so it becomes, as we're looking at the subject of what it means to be his disciple, it's important for us to get embedded in our thinking, because in the last section of the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives 3 examples, illustrations of what it means to be his disciple. And we're only going to look at one this morning. And it was bound up in verse 13. Listen to what he says. Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. And those who find it are few. Let's talk for a few minutes about the narrow gate. As I was preparing to share with you, the thought that occurred to me is here would be a real jumping off place for me to really harangue and harass us all over behaviors and habits and stuff that we used to call that clothesline preaching. Habits, dress styles, entertainments, church attendance, and on and on and on and on and on. And there would be all kinds of things that I could jump onto. 1 or 2 generations ago, that would have been the approach to this text. It was also the approach that caused many people to leave the church. Sometimes because they didn't want to give up practices, habits, and certain pleasures to follow Jesus. They wanted Jesus, but they also wanted their own way of life. They wanted to kind of do their own Jesus plan. But sometimes they left because the things that were so harshly preached about and so focused on as unholy or unchristian were really not moral choices at all, but they were choices of preference. They were choices of the way one person saw it as opposed to the way another person saw it. And I think we have to make room for differences of opinion. Now, you can't have a difference of opinion about adultery. God's pretty clear about that. But God doesn't say thou shalt not to a lot of things that we say thou shalt not. That may not be smart. You may be ending your life early. And we were even selective in some of those things. Anybody ever heard someone preach a message about how smoking isn't a good thing to do? Let me ask you a question. Do you ever hear anybody preach about obesity? Not as often. Not as often. See, and we make choices. And I don't really think that's Jesus' point here. His point is not to, because what are we talking about? Routine obedience from the heart. Routine obedience from the heart. That's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus' words are quite clear, though. And we have to give them fair consideration if we're going to be his disciples. He said that there's a choice between a broad gate and a narrow one. There's a choice between a broad path and a narrow path. And we do have to look at that and take good consideration of it. And I think it's especially important for us right now because we live in a time when broad is the rule of the day. Broad is the rule of the day. Words like tolerant, inclusive, accepting, trans, whatever you want to add after that, are reflective of the mindset of our culture. How many of you grew up when you went to church, if you didn't have a shirt and a tie on, if you were a guy, you may not be let in the door? That wouldn't be that strong. But people would look at you funny. They'd say, oh, you need to get saved. You need to find Jesus. Okay? You know, look at me today. Casual, broad. Now, I'm not saying this is a sin. What I'm saying is it's our mindset. Now, there are some things we needed to loosen up about. But when it comes to the things that Jesus is talking about here, as it relates to walking in a way of discipleship and obedience from the heart, routine obedience from the heart to him, then there are things that we have to look at and things that we have to consider. We have the emphasis on rules, structure, order, guidelines, and systems have given way to relaxed attitudes and expectations in just about all of life. Let me ask you, those of you that are gainfully employed, how many of you have seen a relaxed attitude that's developed in your particular area of employment over the last, 10, 15, 20 years? Okay? I mean, it's simply our mindset. It's our mindset. And again, it's not that it was all bad. But folks, when it becomes a mindset about the things that keep us from living in routine obedience from the heart with God, then that's bad. That is not a good thing. That is something that we need to take serious notice of and give attention to. Another example might be the development of, even within the church world, non-denominational churches. Now, are non-denominational churches bad? No. But a lot of times a non-denominational church will form because people have been hurt where? In denominational churches. And so we think we're somehow going to change things by doing that. And that really misses the point. It really misses the point. The point that I want to leave with you this morning is that the broadness that Jesus is talking about is an attitude. It's a way that we look at life. In many areas, the changes that we might make are unimportant and really are just more matters of opinion as it relates to some of the things we've been very careful or concerned about in the church. But it's interesting to me that Jesus warns against this attitude when it comes to our being his disciple. So what does he mean when he talks about the broad path or the wide gate? It's interesting, there's no hidden meaning to these words. It means simply what it says. The gate's wide and the path is broad. There's no mystery to it. And Jesus clearly indicates that those who are his followers are those who do what he has taught them to do. The broad path and the wide gate reflect our obedience in matters of lifestyle, attitude, and conduct. And the question for us to consider is this, and here's where it becomes routine obedience from the heart. It isn't, is it okay for me to go to this place or go to that place? The question is this, is this something that would please Jesus? That's how we define the broad way and the narrow way, stuff that lies outside of the boundaries of what would be pleasing to Jesus in our lives. And you say, well, Pastor, how do I know that? Well, there's some stuff that he's been really clear about. There are some things that he's been especially clear about. There are other things, and you do this every day, especially if you're married. You make judgments every day about what you think your spouse will or won't like. You do it all the time. And when we're deciding whether or not we're going to walk the broad path or the narrow path, if we're trying to determine what's on the broad path, you and I know enough about Jesus that we can make a good call. We know enough about Jesus as to whether or not what we are contemplating doing in our lives would be consistent with what he would do, because what did we say a disciple does? They do what their teacher does, and they are what their teacher is. That's what being a disciple is. And you and I have enough knowledge from reading God's Word. We have enough knowledge from walking with him and from the other things that he's very clear about in his Word as to what would be appropriate or inappropriate. We can make the call. A lot of times we'll ask somebody else because if they tell us it's okay, it lets us off the hook. And what he's calling you and I to do is to make the assessment, because we know him well enough for us to be able to make that judgment. When we consistently live outside of loving obedience to God, we do jeopardize our relationship with him. But do you know how we do it? It's not because he's going to necessarily give up on us. It's because you and I will fall in love with other things. And that is the huge danger. We will fall in love with other things. And when we fall in love with other things, we turn and walk away from the other things that we don't love as much. That's how marriages break up. You start talking to somebody at work who listens to you And all of a sudden, the next thing you know is your heart is drawn toward that person. And you're not as warmly moved about your spouse anymore. The same thing happens with us in our relationship with the Lord. The narrow path, or the straight gate, Jesus said, leads to the life of discipleship. I said this earlier, sometimes teachers can be hard taskmasters. You know why they're hard taskmasters? Because if we don't do it that way, we're going to miss the point. And if we miss the point here, a small incremental miss here, out there a little ways further, it can become something much, much larger and much, much more damaging and destructive to your life. And so, as we are taught, it's, no, don't do it that way, do it this way. Don't adjust this way, adjust this way. Because in the teacher's mind, he or she knows. And in this case, we're talking about Jesus. Jesus knows. And it becomes important for us to listen and to allow him to adjust our lives, the narrow life. You know what? Just a thought. It just occurred to me. Here's one of the things we need to be alert to when we're trying to make a decision about something. Does this please God or does it not? Because you and I are far more inclined in our human nature to err on the side of the broad path. Because it gives us more room to kind of do what we would like. And if you're weighing something and you say, well, if I do this, it's kind of, I kind of get to do some stuff. And if I do this, well, I'm going to miss some things. If you're going to make a decision, err on the side of narrow. If you've got to decide whether or not you are going to walk in a certain pathway, and you can see this one is the narrow path and this one is the broad path, do not listen to your flesh that allows you to err on the side of the broad path. Because that's always where your flesh is going to take you. Always. Always. Because in the same way that it's hard to pump water upstream, your flesh does not want to do what your spirit knows that it needs to do. It's interesting to me, the words that Jesus uses here. The way is narrow, the gate is hard. Because we are learning our teacher's way. I don't know how many times I sat at a keyboard and did scales. And it was pretty easy when the fingering was simple, when in the opening keys, but then I had to start moving to other keys that had more complex fingerings. And oh my, how many times I would go back and repeat those scales to get them in the right way. And folks, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, but there's the benefit of that. And it's that kind of easy and hard that Jesus is talking about. For us to enter into the narrow gate, for us to walk the narrow path, because it is constricting to our flesh. It does limit us, and you and I can't do everything that our flesh might want to do. But Jesus says it's the path of life, and that if we are going to be his disciples, that's the path for us to walk. That's the path that we must walk. Because it's the path that leads to life. When we do avoid the narrow path, when we do the things that we are being shown by the teacher, it's then we learn to love the teacher. After Bill Walsh, the 49ers coach, passed away with cancer, I remember watching a video of his memorial service, and they had Joe Montana come to be one of the eulogizers. And of course, Bill Walsh and Joe Montana were forever linked together in San Francisco because of the wonderful success they had. And as Montana was talking about Walsh, he was talking about the demands that Walsh made on him to become a good quarterback. Now, I had just caught on ESPN one day a video of some of the training that Bill Walsh did for his quarterbacks, and Montana was the guy that he was working with. And they talked about, as the quarterback, he had, when he would take the snap from center, he had some plays that he would take a 3-step drop and throw the ball. He had other plays where he would take a 5-step drop back. He had other plays where he would take a 7-step drop. And I watched as Coach Walsh observed Montana doing this stuff, and he would stop him in mid-play and he'd say, "No, you didn't bounce off your foot just the right way. No, that should have been a 7-step drop, not a 5-step drop." And all of these details that Walsh, the mentor, the teacher, was pouring into his disciple. Okay? And it would be very easy for a person to step back and say, "I'm done with this. This man is insane." And yet it was because of that I think they won 3 Super Bowl rings and were considered the second best team in all of football history. See, the student learned from the disciple. Folks, that's what God's doing in our lives. And He will continue to discipline us in a healthy way. He will continue to do that as long as we live. How many of you will be reading the scriptures, or you'll be thinking about your previous day? And don't raise your hand, I just want you to think with me. And you will recall something that you were feeling bad about because you didn't quite perform up to what you knew was the Lord's expectation of you. And it might even be a little bit more poignant to you because it's something that you've messed up in before. Now, the wonderful thing is God in His grace continues to mentor us. He continues to make us those apprentices who will become like Him, and He will continue to do that. But it's just those little adjustments in our lives that make the difference between an average person and someone that is growing in the continual practice of obedience from the heart. And we allow God to shape us and mold us. When we learn to love our teacher, our obedience comes from our love for and trust of His ways. And folks, when we read verses that say to us, enter into the narrow gate, it's not because God has any kind of pleasure in telling us it's a narrow way or a narrow gate. God takes no pleasure in that. What He's telling us is, guys, this is the way it works. This is the way I have designed the world and life to work. Now, I'm giving you insider information on how it happens. Will you let me form you in a way that will launch you into the fullness of life that you've longed for as long as you've been alive, even before you knew what it was you were looking for? If we're going to be disciples, we have to enter the narrow gate. I was thinking about this realizing or remembering that we would be coming to communion today. Talking about the broad way. There was no broad way for Jesus. It was a very narrow, exacting, demanding way. Because there was only one way for us to find relationship back with God. But what was launched in Jesus as a result was the fact that now his is the name above every other name. That every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. That's not a power trip, folks. That's because Jesus allowed God to work through him and break the power of sin for all of humanity. And because of that, that's his reward. God has reward for us as well when we walk the narrow path.